2013, and I'd like to welcome you to the Veritas Forum at Dartmouth College. The Veritas Forum is an opportunity for the Dartmouth community to come together and explore life's hardest questions. The students and campus ministers who have planned this forum are inspired by the idea that Jesus Christ has something relevant to offer our institution in its search for knowledge, truth, and significance. With that inspiration, we welcome those who bring other backgrounds, perspectives, and commitments to the table. And we honor all questions just as we bring questions of our own. And our hope is that the Veritas Forum will not be just an academic exchange of ideas, but rather that it will come out of real community, earnestly exploring questions of real importance. We hope tonight's events will draw all of its participants into real conversations, questions, discussions, stories, and friendships. The Veritas Forum at Dartmouth College is sponsored by Agape Christian Fellowship, Aquinas House, Atheists, Humanists, Agnostics at Dartmouth, Christ Redeemer Church, Christian Union, Crew Dartmouth, the C.S. Lewis Society, Day Foundation, Dartmouth Apologia, Dartmouth Faculty and Staff Christian Fellowship, Eleazar Wheelock Society, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, the Navigators, the Office of Pluralism and Leadership, the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life at the Tucker Foundation, the Waterman Institute, and Wellspring Worship Center. We're grateful for all the students, professors, campus ministers, and alumni who helped create this forum. Before we continue, I'm going to ask you to dim the lights on your phones. We're not going to ask you to turn them off because we will be using them through the forum. And I'm also going to ask you to locate your nearest exit in case of an emergency. Also, if you would like to take pictures, please no flash. You are welcome to try and take pictures, but there will be pictures posted online at a later date. During the first few minutes of the presentation, I'm going to encourage you to fill out the cards that are on your seats. How about we fill it out together? The first question is your role on campus. My role on campus is staff member, recent graduate. Your childhood background. My childhood background was Christian. My current orientation is Christian as well. Now, if you look at the next question, it says, send me a one-time survey and enter me to win an iPad. So, what you have to lose? So, if you can give us your email address. And what's your biggest question after tonight's Veritas Forum? You have the rest of the forum to fill out, and you can leave your card on your seat and we'll collect them at the end. Okay, we want everyone to fill out the follow-up survey, which will be emailed to you, whatever your background or beliefs, because the survey helps us create forums that are relevant, thought-provoking, and engaging for our entire campus. We need your feedback to make next year even better than this one. So please take a minute to make sure you fill that out. We promise we won't spam you. So before we begin, we'd like to start with a poll. If you try to persuade me to change my beliefs, you're being intolerant. If you agree, it's arrogant to think you've found the truth. Text arrogant to 22333. If you agree it's tolerant to tell me I'm wrong, text intolerant. Disagree, it's respectful to acknowledge differences. Respectful. Disagree, it's loving if you're trying to help your friend. You can see the responses coming in. How insightful is this, don't you think? Keep the responses coming. I know there's more than 59 of you out there. All right. Universities today talk a great deal about the need for tolerance. Tolerance demands only that you peacefully coexist with others, text coexisting, that you don't judge others, don't judge, that you don't tell others what they should believe, don't tell, that you affirm all worldviews as equally legitimate. All right, give you a few more seconds. All right. Dartmouth is a diverse community. What's required to create a respectful community in the face of differences? We should affirm all worldviews and positions are equally true. We should never try to persuade anyone to change their beliefs. We should listen to others' beliefs, but that doesn't make them true. We should actively discuss worldviews in pursuit of truth. Okay. How do you wish conversation at Dartmouth could be described? Text conversation and the word that you would use to describe or you wish described conversation here at Dartmouth. And we'll see responses in a word cloud as they come in. Okay. Throughout the talk, we want you to be thinking of questions that are relevant to today's discussion. So if you have a question, text Ask Ravi and your question to the same number. We're going to leave the number out here so you can have it for reference. But a friendly reminder, if you can put your phones on silence and also dim the lights as to not interfere with the lecture. With that said, it is now my privilege to introduce our presenter for tonight. Ravi Zacharias is a noted Christian thinker and apologist to speak about pluralism, tolerance, and peace. For 35 years, Ravi Zacharias has spoken all over the world and in numerous universities, notably Harvard, Princeton, and Oxford University. He has addressed world leaders on the topics of peace and pluralism on many occasions and is the author of numerous books, including Can Man Live Without God?, Jesus Among Other Gods, and The Lotus and the Cross, Jesus Talks with Buddha. He has been privileged to speak at the National Day of Prayer, the Pentagon, the United Nations Annual Prayer Breakfast, and First Annual Prayer Breakfast for African Leaders. He is presently Senior Research Fellow at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford University in Oxford, England. Please help me welcome Ravi Zacharias.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. I hope you feel the same when it's over. Just nice to be welcomed and into this beautiful auditorium on such an enormous theme. And I'm just fascinated by how the technology puts together everything so quickly, so we immediately know what everybody is thinking and almost hearing people change their minds. Now that's as incredible as it gets. The evening will be as follows. I will present my talk for about 45 minutes. Interestingly enough, let me give you at least a one-line description because it'll add to the theme of today. My ancestors came from the highest caste of the Hindu priesthood in the Deep South. I myself became a follower of Jesus in my teens. I mention all of that to say because at the end of my talk, I'll be joined for a Q&A session by Dr. Nabil Qureshi, whose parents actually hail from Pakistan. And he was formerly a Muslim and now a follower of Christ himself. And I find it incredible when I think of this because I was born and raised in India. And if there's any point of tension in India today, it is the whole issue of the Indo-Pak conflict. All that goes on and rages. I've just returned from India a few days ago. And here we are, two of us, talking on the issue of tolerance in an American university campus. Two brown faces coming up onto the platform to speak to an audience like this. Only in America could we have such a privilege accorded, and hopefully what follows from a discussion can also be of great meaning. It reminds me of the gentleman who walked into a room, and he was from Japan, walked into this dining room, and there was a table at the front, and he sat down, and the Englishman looking at him thought maybe he would help him a bit. So when the Japanese gentleman sat down and was opening a book of his, the English gentleman looked at him and picked up the spoon and said, "This be spoony." And then he took the knife and said, "And this be knifey, and this be forky, and this be platey." And the Japanese gentleman kept nodding. At the end of the lunch, to the shock of the Englishman, the Japanese gentleman was the keynote speaker. And he delivered the talk in flawless English, sat down and looked at the Englishman and said, "You likey speechy?" I feel a little bit like that today, although I'm not sure you likey the speechy. But it's just wonderful to have a privilege of being in such a distinguished institution. Thank you to all of the groups that have made it possible for me to be here, for your kindness, your warm invitation. And when Nabil joins me, you'll truly be inspired to hear from a man like him, a medical doctor by training, but picked up other degrees along the way. He is part of my team now, and I think on a theme of tolerance, I thought it would be just exciting to have some of his perspectives as well. I was raised in India in a minority, both living in the north, coming from the south, and by virtue of my faith, India is, of course, 80% Hindu, 10% Muslim. Christian population at that time was less than 2%, more like 4% now. So growing up in those settings, you get accustomed to believing in a counter perspective, or learning to live in a pluralistic society is a constant challenge. I returned from India last week, and amazingly, to find audiences packed in every case, whether it is a business community or the acting world of Bollywood, or whether it was the medical school in the South in Vellore, every setting to have a packed audience, asking questions about faith, about purpose, about meaning, and what it really means to be human. Once upon a time, I'd be standing in front of Indian audiences like that, terrified, because I knew my worldview would be quite dramatically different to that of the audience in front of me. And now when you stand up and speak of those, notably a few times I've done it with the Bollywood world, how they will lean forward, listen, interact, ask some of the brightest questions. And it is a marvelous example of what it is to be able to discuss issues of such incredible importance, some of which could actually go deep into the consciences, laying claim to that conscience, but to do it in a civil way, without rancor, without hate, and without that sense of bitterness that oftentimes disagreements can spawn. So I hope whatever happens tonight, that one thing that we can see accomplished is at the end of it, around your tables or your homes or in your classroom, that these issues can be discussed without that hostility. Because let's ask ourselves one fundamental question. What is the ultimate goal in a civilized society? Is it really that we will all agree with each other? I doubt it. That is really to pursue the impossible. But what is possible is that even in the midst of our disagreement, we will learn to live in a civil way, as deep as those differences might be. I have learned to live that way. I've learned to be in audiences like that. Many times I'm in Islamic universities. I know how tense those audiences will be. I remember a few years ago being in the oldest Islamic University of Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur, and in front of that audience with mullahs and scholars sitting in the front row, having to speak for 1 hour in the defense of my faith. And I tell you the truth, at the end of it, when I walked in, the professor of world religions there was Professor Baharuddin, specializing in Islamics, and her actual words to me were, if it were not improper, I would lean over and give you an embrace and give you a hug for the way the subject matter was handled today. And I said, Professor Baharuddin, that's the best compliment you can give to me. So whether it's in a Buddhist framework or a Hindu framework or an Islamic framework or a secular framework, this is my calling. And if there is any way in which I have offended you without warrant or without meaning to come across in the way I did, please do not hesitate to let me know, because that is not my intent. My intent is to get us thinking seriously and in a sober-minded way, because America is at the crossroads. The North America into which I came in my 20s is very different to the North America of today. And one has to be incredibly cautious, as one word can create such turmoil and go viral within minutes and create havoc for everybody. That does not really benefit the subject matter at all. So please, as we present it, we want to do it with sensitivity, and if there are points of deep tension, what I would want more than anything else is for you to let us know, so that we know at least that we are standing on a clear ground of communication. In the 1980s, there was an article written in Atlantic Monthly in which America was being discussed as a country on a dramatically different course to how far it had come in prior years. So 1980s was the year the sociologists were beginning to really delineate all the changes that were taking place. And the article written by Daniel Yankelevich began with a definition of culture, and this is how he worded it. Culture is an effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives. So when you take that statement alone, you see that it is setting before us the course of coherence as the goal to answer the existential questions, meaning the felt questions of the heart and the mind as they are bridged, to find a coherent set of answers to the existential questions that confront all of us in the passage of our lives. That is the goal of what culture is intended to be, as Yankelevich and Bell and other social theorists were commenting. But then they went on to say this: we are in the midst of a cultural revolution in America. And they were looking at the previous 2 decades, from the 60s into the 80s. And here's what they said: a genuine cultural revolution then is one that makes a decisive break with the shared meanings of the past, particularly those which relate to the deepest questions of the purpose and nature of human life. A cultural revolution is underway when you make a decisive break from the shared meanings of the past, particularly on the issues of the purpose and meaning of life. And they said that decisive break had taken place from the shared meanings of the past. A cultural revolution was in full sway. As they began to discuss the various issues that were causing this dissonance and the discord, in a fascinating end to the article, here's what he does. He goes and surveys individuals and couples to come to the conclusion as to what it is they now really felt on the heels of this revolution that had begun 2 decades earlier. And here's one couple by the name of Abby and Mark, and this is the way Yankelevich summarized it. If you feel it is imperative to fill all of your needs, and if these needs are contradictory or in conflict with those of others or simply unfillable, then frustration inevitably follows. To Abby and to Mark as well, self-fulfillment means having a career and marriage and children and sexual freedom and autonomy and being liberal and having money and choosing nonconformity and insisting on social justice and enjoying city life and country living and simplicity and graciousness and reading and good friends and on and on. But the individual is not truly fulfilled by becoming ever more autonomous. Indeed, to move too far in this direction is to risk psychosis, the ultimate form of autonomy. And then he ends with these incredible words: the injunction that to find oneself, one must lose oneself, contains a truth any seeker of self-fulfillment needs to grasp. The injunction that to find oneself, one must lose oneself, contains a truth any seeker of self-fulfillment needs to grasp. Now, if the social theorists, in studying all the cultural shifts that were underway, come to this conclusion that in the end you cannot really pursue contradictorily fulfilling passions, you will end up with a collapse from within if you attempt to do that. And he says what really matters then at that point is that the breakdown within reveals to you that if you want to find yourself, you have to give up some things. You have to lose yourself. And it is a truth that's very hard for us in North America to come to terms with. Now, what's true of Mark and Abby is true of a family. What's true of a family is true of a community. What's true of a community is true of a culture. The statement is positively clear that in order to find oneself, one must lose oneself, contains a truth any seeker of self-fulfillment needs to grasp. Now, here it is. He's laying down a truth in the pursuit of self-fulfillment. And I think it is critical we understand that if this great nation is to survive with the nobility and the dignity of the intent with which it started, then sacrifices will have to be made from everybody in all ways of thinking, and to come to the terms that we simply cannot have it in every way, in all of our longings and all of our fulfillments. It will never be so, for they are contradictory in pursuit. Now, I want to help you travel with me for the last 30 to 40 years when this change came, and describe 3 moods that took over. The first 2 are very critical entry points for culture. Nothing wrong with the entry point. It is the exit point that has created dangers, which is where, therefore, we need to take a step back to redefine what we actually mean by the entry point. There are three moods that began to take over. Writers were dealing with it, and the secular city was being penned, and all the descriptions of a secularized worldview were becoming front and center. And so the first mood that took over very radically in articulation was the mood called secularization. What do I mean by that? Secularization is the process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations are losing their social significance. It's a process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations are losing their social significance. Very readily, if you take any volatile issue of our time that's socially really divisive, and you put a panel in front of you, and you've got a psychologist or a highly educated philosopher or a social theorist, a medical doctor, a university president, a lawyer, and put a minister in the midst of that, and the discussion is underway, to an average person sitting in the audience, the skeptic will say the minister is the most prejudiced of the whole group by virtue of being in ministry. The assumption will be made that everyone else is quite objective, has done his or her philosophical or theoretical homework, and there's no degree of subjectivity there. Only the religiously minded person is being subjective. I have a colleague of mine sitting in the audience right now. She went to a very prestigious university here in the United States. And in one of her lectures, the professor was constantly on an assault of the Christian faith. Now, I find that very fascinating. I know that same professor would never do it with Hinduism, or with Buddhism, or with Islam, certainly not with Islam, because he probably may not be making too many more speeches on the subject. It's true, because they will not take the offense of attempting to blaspheme that which they consider sacred. Richard Dawkins, if he really had the courage about all his anti-theistic thinking, ought to stand up in audiences where he sees the kind of hostility that he vents with his worldview and find out that all not worldviews are created equal. But this young student was sitting in the class and raised her hand, and she says to the professor, "I don't appreciate it. You are constantly attacking that which is sacred to me." And what does she get in return? She's sent to the dean's office. So she goes over to the dean's office, and she says, "I don't know why I'm here." He says, "Because you're being disruptive in the classroom." She said, "I'm not being disruptive in the classroom. I'm just taking issue with the fact that in a totally unrelated discipline and subject, he constantly finds a reason to attack that which is my faith. I just don't see the connection." And he says to her, "You are here for an education." She says, "I'm not getting an education in this. I'm being indoctrinated." He said, "No, ma'am, you've got this all wrong. For 18 years in your home and your family, you have been indoctrinated. We are now going to educate you." Whoa. I dare the same professor to try the track and stack in some other settings. You see, nothing is accomplished by that. But what has really happened in the mix of secularization is that we've got this whole mindset where if you have a religious worldview, you are automatically living by, quote, faith. And if you've got a naturalistic framework, you are automatically living by reason. It is interesting that the framers of the documents of this country signed the documents with this statement: "We put our names with our sacred honor." With our sacred honor. That's not a scientific statement. That's a statement that your honor and your integrity are at stake when you're putting your name to a document and all the ideas with which you wish to shape this country. I find it absolutely staggering. I've been invited repeatedly to China and back again to lecture, And the education system in China is asking people like myself to come and talk on ethics. And they will openly tell you that they know the impact of the Judeo-Christian worldview within American culture that has kept that culture somehow cohesive and strong and ethically finding its norms. And that's really all they want from here, how to build that ethical cohesiveness within a Marxist framework. Fascinating that they see the need of an ethical cohesiveness for it all. But as I look and watch the changes taking place, where does this get us off? What is the exit point? And writers are incredibly insightful and incisive in the way they are actually portraying what has happened. I've always believed that the Scottish philosophical activist Andrew Fletcher in the 1800s made the comment, thus he said, "Let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws. It's the poets and the lyricists who will get to the heart of the issue much more quickly than the theorists would." And here's what one writer in England, Steve Turner, tongue-in-cheek, has to say about the West. He said, "What do we believe? What is our creed? We believe in Marx, Freud, and Darwin. We believe everything is okay, as long as you don't hurt anyone to the best of your definition of hurt and to the best of your definition of knowledge. We believe in sex before, during, and after marriage. We believe in the therapy of sin. We believe that adultery is fun. We believe that only taboos are taboo. We believe that everything is getting better despite evidence to the contrary. The evidence must be investigated, and you can prove anything with evidence. We believe there's something in horoscopes, UFOs, and bent spoons. Jesus was a good man, just like Buddha, Muhammad, and ourselves. He was a good moral teacher, although we think some of his good morals were basically bad. We believe that all religions are really the same, at least the ones that we read were. They all believe in love and goodness. They only differ on matters of creation, sin, heaven, hell, God, and salvation. We believe that after death comes the nothing, because when you ask the dead what happens, they say nothing. If death is not the end, and if the dead have lied, then it's compulsory heaven for all, excepting perhaps Hitler, Stalin, and Genghis Khan. We believe in Masters and Johnson. What's selected is average. What's average is normal. What's normal is good. We believe in total disarmament. We believe there are direct links between warfare and bloodshed. Americans should beat their guns into tractors, and the Russians would be sure to follow. We believe that man is essentially good. It's only his behavior that lets him down. This is the fault of society. Society is the fault of conditions. Conditions are the fault of society. We believe that each man must find the truth that is right for him, and reality will adapt accordingly. The universe will readjust. History will alter. We believe that there is no absolute truth, excepting for the truth that there is no absolute truth. We believe in the rejection of creeds and the flowering of individual thought. And then he adds this postscript. If chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear a state of emergency, sniper kills 10, troops on rampage, youths go looting, bomb blasts school, it is but the sound of man worshiping his maker. If chance is the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, troops on rampage, youths go looting, bomb blast school, it is but the sound of man worshiping his maker. Where do we get off with this? Where do we exit when we make secularization with an uppercase S to evict all religious thought and all religious belief in the public square, which is really what often happens? Where do we get off? I'll tell you what happens. The definitions to which we cling will become extremely elusive till we do not know where to draw the lines of difference anymore. I give the illustration in the 1980s of Larry Flynt being brought to trial in Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta's been my home for 25 years now. And Larry Flynt's pornography was considered so bad that even those who were discussing it would say it made Playboy magazine look very normal and very acceptable. The perversions and all that were going on in his magazine, so he was taken to court. But the lawyer defending him had a very clever ploy. The clever ploy was basically something like this: asking a potential juror if they had first if they had gone to church. And if they had ever gone to church, then they didn't qualify to be in the jury because they'd be prejudiced. But once they got selected, he would quiz them thus. Have you ever gone into an art gallery? Yes. Have you ever paid to go into an art gallery? Yes. Have you ever paid to go into an art gallery to see the paintings of the great masters of art? Yes. Have you paid to do that and go in and see those paintings sometimes of disrobed people? Yes. Would you explain now to this, he would ask the witness, would you explain to this jury why you paid to do that and you called it art and you call my client's stuff pornography? So bring the witness up, ask him all these questions. You paid to go into an art gallery where you saw paintings of disrobed people and you called it art. Explain to this jury why you call that art and why you call my client's stuff pornography. And of course, you don't get into a philosophical debate at that point. But I thought to myself, it's a good question. It's a loaded question. I can't minimize it. But if I sat across that lawyer in a conversation, a cup of coffee in hand, and he asked me the same question, I'd ask him, have you read the biography of Michelangelo? Michelangelo was beginning to do that, and his lawyer teacher wanted to just caution him for his motive and being circumspect. And he looked at my young Michelangelo and he said to him, why are you doing this? Michelangelo said, because I want to see man as God sees man. And he said, that's right. Just remember, you're not God. Tuck that at the back of your mind and move to this. C.S. Lewis, in his book, A Pilgrim's Regress, talking about his own conversion. He calls it a pilgrim's regress rather than progress because he was confronted with pantheism, with naturalism, all of that along the way. And he kept rejecting them one by one, this great mind, this great scholar. But he didn't know why. He said until he came to have that relationship with Christ, and he took a regressive journey because he had the answers. In this book, allegorically, talks of the time he was in humanism by the spirit of the age, in the mountain called the spirit of the age. And he pictures himself bound in shackles in the spirit of the age. Fascinating picture. That here he is in the humanistic framework, picturing himself enslaved, almost like what somebody today would describe like a Boris Becker in his recently released book, Life is Not a Game. You enshackle yourself by some of your habits. And so it was with Lewis, referring to himself as John. And at one point, the waiter brings him a tray with his breakfast, unshackles him to give him his breakfast. And he enjoys the milk and comments on the tastiness and the nourishing flavor of this milk. And the waiter smiles at him and he says, you only call it nourishing, you only call it tasty. It's a secretion of a cow, isn't it? It secretes urine, it secretes milk. That's all it is. It's the secretion of a cow that you're enjoying. He nearly gags over that. And then he said, I made the mistake of commenting on the eggs. Till the waiter reminded me what they were. And he said, I don't know what to do. The tray is taken from me. I'm in shackles again. He said, all of a sudden, reason comes riding on a horse and rescues me and says to the man in the spirit of the age, you lie because you don't know the difference between what nature is meant for nourishment and what nature is meant for garbage. You don't know the difference between what nature is meant for nourishment and what nature is meant for refuse. You see, for the man or the woman in front of the lens of the camera, whose body is being used purely to titillate the fanciful imagination of somebody who's buying into it, whose mind will be so assaulted in a way that no human being in this world would have the capacity of ever satisfying. Where it's a feeling that is pursued, where it's an imagination that has been assaulted. The person sitting in front of the lens of that camera ought to say, don't do this to me. Don't do this to me. But the person won't, because when secularization has done its full work, it'll produce a generation devoid of shame. That's the question we need to ask at the exit point of our culture. Are there issues in our lives that ought to bring shame, that ought to bring guilt, that ought to bring some sense of remorse? My daughter, Naomi, works with rescuing women from the sex trafficking industry. And she's just a wee little thing. And I'm terrified sometimes when I see her going on these trips. She'll go into Amsterdam, into the red light district. They know her there now. She'll go in and ask for just a few minutes. They'll turn that red light off. They're just being carted back and forth from countries by men who own them, using them till they're in their mid-20s or late 20s, and they're done and finished and gone with. In Thailand, they're brought in from the time in their early teens. By 21 or 22, a high percentage of them with AIDS just discarded. If a person doesn't know the difference between art and pornography, or the peddling of the human body for the sake of some momentary thrill, then secularization has done its deadly work, and it's reminded you and me at that point that if no transcendent moral ethic is brought to bear upon the nature of what we are essentially meant to be, then there's nothing to stop this slide down and down and down and down, reminding me of the words of Hitler in Auschwitz. I want to raise a generation of young people devoid of a conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel. You know, I spoke at Angola prison some months ago. It is a prison where 85% of them are on life without parole, 45 on death row. When you went into prison there years ago, it was the bloodiest prison in the country. You would see blood marks, they tell me, on the walls, on the carpets, on the ceiling, and when you were checked in as a prisoner, you were given a knife to defend yourself. I'll tell you what happened and changed, but that's not germane to what I want to say to you right now, except this. When I walked into the room where they are executed, I'll tell you what, every bone within your body is reacting, every fiber is reacting within you, wondering, could you ever be the one to turn that switch on? And the chaplain was telling me he doesn't go to those rooms anymore. He can't stand the thought of it, because he watches the prisoner lying there and the phone, is it going to ring in the last minute for a reprieve of some sort and a stay? He said, the last one I saw, a man was on death row for having raped and murdered his own daughter. And the wife was sitting behind glass watching the execution about to take place. He said, I just about broke down completely when he turned his head towards his wife in that last second and just said, I'm sorry. You know, there's a sliver of a ray of hope there. Just a sliver of a ray of hope. And the man just turned and said, it's okay, like Eichmann did. Not a problem. Walks to the gallows saying, it's all okay. I don't believe in any of this afterlife stuff. Think carefully. Where do we want to get off with secularization if there is no transcendent worldview that is going to be allowed in the public square? If nothing of that is going to be tolerated by virtue of the fact that it believes in a thought that is branded religious. Second is pluralization. Pluralization is where there's a competing number of worldviews available to its members and no one worldview is dominant. A competing number of worldviews available to its members and no one worldview is dominant. Now, I want you to know, I think pluralization is the best way in which society ought to function. I am a privileged visitor to North America. When I was 20 years old, I'd never left home. I was a home guy. My older brother was 22, I was 20, and my father bought us both tickets to go to Toronto, Canada. He said, go and find a job there, find a living there. He told me to go and find a university education and somehow earn on part-time. He just left us on our own. We had $400 in our pocket. That's it. The government of India wouldn't allow you any more foreign exchange than that. So the first few days, we were literally living on one hot dog and Coke a day till we'd find a job somewhere. And I come into this world all of a sudden and I think to myself, you know what a great privilege Canada has given me. I'm here as a guest. They don't owe me this. And at that time in Canada, there were 500 Indians in the city of Toronto in mid-1960s. I was one of the 500. Today, when you go to Toronto, there's 500,000 in Toronto alone. When I first came there, if you saw an Indian across the street, you'd cross and talk and go and have a kahaya, chai pe okay, let's go and have a cup of tea. If I did that in Toronto today, I'll never get anywhere. Completely changed, completely changed. Pluralization, as somebody described Los Angeles, where on the side of the road there's a cart where a Korean is selling kosher tacos. That's pluralization of cuisine. And I think pluralization of cuisine is absolutely delightful, because when I arrived in Toronto, they had only one Indian restaurant, and it was an apology for Indian cuisine. When I went there, I said, I would never like this stuff too, and I told them, you really should change this to imaginary cuisine. It's not Indian cuisine. Today, some of the best Indian restaurants in the world are in Toronto. People ask me, why do Indians die so young? I say, because God's getting them up there quicker to prepare the marriage supper of the Lamb. When we get there, the food is going to be Indian, you know. Indian cuisine, one Englishman described it to me as a hunk and a sip and a chunk and a blow. The hot pepper just gets to you, but my, what a foretaste of all the glories that could lie ahead. Plurality of cuisine is fascinating. You know, when I was 26, I married Margie. She's from Canada. There were two other Indian guys who also married Canadian girls, and we used to meet once a month or whenever we could, and we called it the Zebra Fellowship. We're from India, our wives are from Canada. It was so rare to see that happening. So much has changed, and wonderfully for the better. Take a look at the faculties around the world today and see the number of Indian doctors and Indian engineers. It's a great thing to experience this. Pluralization is a marvelous thing in society, and the world salutes America and Canada and parts of Europe for opening the doors to get the privilege given to people from other parts of the world to come and enjoy the goodness of the land. So I thank you. Here's what I want to say. If pluralization is ever extrapolated into meaning moral relativism, then the exit point is deadly again. If secularization leads you to no point of reference for shame, nothing can be branded as shameful, then pluralization lives with the danger that ultimately there is no absolute, there is no reason, there is no rationality, there are no boundaries, there are no absolutes. Once again, the musicians point this out to us. King Crimson, Cat's Foot, Iron Claw, neurosurgeons scream for more, from Paranoia's Poison Door, 21st century schizoid man. Blood rack, barbed wire, politicians, funeral pyre, innocents raped with napalm fire, 21st century schizoid man. The walls on which the prophets wrote is cracking at the seams. Upon the instruments of death, the sunlight brightly gleams. Will no one lay the laurel wreath as silence drowns the screams? Between the iron gates of fate, the seeds of time are sown and watered by the deeds of those who know and who are known. Knowledge is a deadly friend when no one sets the rules. The fate of all mankind, I see, is in the hands of fools. Confusion will be my epitaph as I crawl a cracked and broken path. If we make it, we can all sit back and laugh, but I'm afraid tomorrow I'll be crying. G.K. Chesterton says the same thing in a more poignant and more powerful passage. And when I read that to you, you'll find few have articulated it with such brilliance. Here's what he says. Listen carefully. Speaking to the rebel who wants to rebel against all moral absolutes. Listen to what he says. The new rebel is a skeptic and will not entirely trust anything. He has no loyalty. Therefore, he can never be a true revolutionist. And the fact that he doubts everything gets in his way when he wants to denounce anything. For all denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind. And the modern revolutionist doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. So he writes one book complaining that imperial oppression insults the purity of women. Then he writes another book, a novel in which he insults it himself. He curses the Sultan because Christian girls lose their virginity, then curses Mrs. Grundy because they keep it. As a politician, he cries out that war is a waste of life, then as a philosopher that life itself is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant, then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie, then denounces aristocratic profligates for treating it as a lie. He calls the flag a bauble, then blames the oppressors of Poland or Ireland because they take away that bauble. Bobo. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts. Then he takes his hat and umbrella and goes on to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is always engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt has become practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he's lost his right to rebel against anything. Pretty powerful stuff. Pretty powerful language. I'll never forget, I'll give this as my illustration here and then move to my final thought quickly here. I was in California once doing a series of lectures, and a professor came up to me, and he was quite strident and quite loud and quite hostile. And he says to me, I want you to speak one night, it's an American gentleman talking to me, on why you're not a Hindu. I said, I won't speak on that. He said, I dare you to do it. He said, I dare you to do it. Because I have become one myself, and I teach that in my class. I'll bring my whole class in philosophy. If you speak on that subject, I will bring all of them, and they'll rip you to shreds afterwards. I thought that's supposed to be an enticing invitation for me to take on the subject. I said, no, I won't bite. I said, but I'll tell you what I'll do. Bring your whole class. I will speak on why I'm a Christian, and if you want to tear me to shreds after that, we can do it. He said, well, I don't like that, but if that's what you want to do, okay. So they came. You could just tell which was the philosophy section in the auditorium that night. So at the end of my defense on talking about the law of non-contradiction and why that mutually exclusive truths cannot both be accepted without some qualification, and why the claims of all of these worldviews, not just Christianity, but Hinduism is exclusive, Buddhism is exclusive, Islam is, they all lay claim to that. I said, so don't just put it in one direction, and it's reasonable that a claim would have to claim exclusivity. The question is whether it can be defended. So when I finished my talk on my defense of the Christian faith, he came up to the front and he began by saying this, you have done the greatest damage to this worldview that I've ever heard any man do in this, and that's because you really don't understand Eastern philosophy. I said, all right, sir. I said, let me stop you right there. I'm not going to get into it with you here because you're going to try to impress your students. I'm going to try to impress them. We're going to lose truth along the way. I want to get to the truth. I said, let's go out for a meal. You pay, I'll pray, and we'll talk. And so he agreed, He said, can I bring the professor of psychology with me? I was sure at that point because he wanted us to be studied by somebody else. So the three of us went out. And we go out, and this professor of philosophy starts with a talk. His opening line was flawed, but you don't stop anybody that soon. He looked at me and he said, there are only two kinds of logic. It was dead wrong, but I didn't stop him. And then he goes on to explain, there is this either-or kind of logic, the law of non-contradiction, either this or that. It is a Western way of thinking. I said, no, it's not. He said, yes, it is. I said, no, it's not. He said, yes, it is. I said, no, it's not. He said, yes, it is. I said, all right, move on. He said, then we move to the both-and kind of logic. It is not either this or that, both this and that. The thesis spawning its antithesis, you come together for a synthesis. What Marx used in his dialectical materialism, he said Eastern philosophy uses it in its pursuit of nirvana and moksha and all of that. So for them it is not either this or that, it is both this and that. It's an Eastern way of thinking. I said, no, it isn't. He said, yes, it is. I said, no, it's not. I said, yes, it is. He said, what do you mean, no, it's not? I said, keep going. So he finished. I said, are you finished? He said, yes. I said, so you've told me the either-or, the law of non-contradiction is a Western way of thinking. The both-and, the dialectical way of thinking is the Eastern way of thinking. And what you have told me is that the reason I have debunked every other worldview that moves the dialectical way is because I don't understand it. You told me that if I understand the fact that you can accept contradictory statements, I would never do away with these kinds of thinking. I should understand their logic first, and for them both-and applies, not either-or. So you have to take contradiction and accept it. I said, that's what you're saying? He said, yes. He had taken all the placemats and drawn out his argument. The Western way of thinking, either or, Eastern way of thinking, both and I'm really doing injustice to the Eastern way of thinking because I should be content with contradiction. I said, sir, I just have one question for you. You're telling me when I study this worldview, I either use the both-hand system or nothing else. Is that right? I either use the both-hand logic or nothing else. Is that right? He'd only just started to eat. And he put his knife and fork down, and I quote, here's what he says to me: "The either or does seem to emerge, doesn't it?" And the professor of psychology said, "I think we can go now." I said, "I want to tell you something, sir. Even in India, we look both ways before we cross the street. It is either the bus or me, not both of us." I said, "You don't understand either Shankara or Gautama Buddha. If Gautama Buddha believed in the both hand, explain to me why it was he was born a Hindu and walked away from Hinduism and started his own pursuit of enlightenment. Why couldn't he take both hands? Why did Shankara write his dissertation and his thesis on the exclusivity of the Vedic literature and so on?" You see, ladies and gentlemen, truth has a jagged edge. It ultimately will stab you if you try to walk against it. Winston Churchill said the most valuable thing in the world is the truth. It is so valuable that often it is hidden by a bodyguard of lies. Andrei Sakharov, Natan Sharansky, the former justice minister in the Soviet Union, went back from Israel to the former place where he had been imprisoned in solitary confinement. He took his wife, and as he went back to the prison, his wife was about to go with him. He said, "Could you stand out for a moment, please? I want to go in alone." He said, "Because I sat there for day after day after day, dark in that dungeon where I really found myself." And Sharansky went there and wept, thinking of how they nearly destroyed him. But as he came out, he asked if he could go to the grave of Andrei Sakharov, the physicist who gave Russia the atomic bomb. And the media followed him, and he went and laid a wreath at Sakharov's grave. And he came back and said, "The reason I have done this is because of what Sakharov said to me." He said, "I always thought the most powerful weapon in the world was the bomb. I have changed my mind. The most powerful weapon in the world is the truth." Does America want the truth? With pluralization, which is a good thing, are we going to exit with an absolutizing of relativism? Think about it. And finally, privatization, where what you believe in the most sacred, you're forced to keep to the private and never bring it into the public. That's where America is headed. And with great sadness, I say to you, this is the deadliest of all mistakes we are making. Because that which is sacred to you in private is also sacred to you in public. It ought to be a serious thing. I have learned to live with disagreement. I've learned to give people all the floor time they want in dialoguing and defending and debating. But I've walked away embracing that person and saying, truth will win out in the end. We have the right to disagree, but we don't have the right to be disagreeable. I'll tell you what I've noticed in 41 years of travel, and I'll close with an illustration or two here. It is this. The cancer of our time can be described in one word: meaninglessness. Meaninglessness. You talk to an average young person today, how many sexual trysts do they really want to find fulfillment? How much money in the bank do they really want to find fulfillment? The loneliest people in the world I have found have been the most indulgent ones who've come away totally empty. As Chesterton said, meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain. Meaninglessness comes from being weary of pleasure. Meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain. Meaninglessness comes from being weary of pleasure. Skeptics often tell me that it's the problem of pain that keeps them from believing in God. May I suggest to you, it's the problem of pleasure that keeps me from being totally secular. Been there, done that, tried this. It simply doesn't work. I recall when I was doing a Bible study with the Atlanta Braves when they were playing the St. Louis Cardinals, sort of 10, 12 minutes each of the chapels. And I walked in there, and I closed with this. I said to them, you know, fellas, there's nothing like walking into a room and being the only one who fails the physical. I said, I looked at you boys, muscles bulging like watermelons, and I walk in here. I'll never forget the line of my wife once when I gave her a nice, good hug. She smiled, hugged me back, and said, you know what? You have the arms of a thinking man. I burst out laughing. And she said, I didn't mean it. I didn't mean that in a bad way. I didn't mean that. Oh, what a compliment. What a compliment. I said, I'll do my best to make these the arms of a non-thinking man. So I said, guys, I can't talk to you about baseball. You guys hit a ball long before I know it's even come. So no, I'm not going to talk to you about that. I said, here's what I want to talk to you about. How to live your life on the road, because I've probably lived that longer than any one of you sitting in front of me. They leaned forward and started to listen. One of the most notable players from one of the teams, multi-million-dollar contract, walks up towards me, and he puts his hand on the back of my neck like this, and then puts his head on my shoulder and starts to sob. And my travel assistant, knowing it was a very precious moment for him, just walked away into the distance, and he looked at me and he said, Ravi, I have more money than I ever thought I'd have, but I want to tell you I've lost everything of real value in my life. I wished I'd applied the principles you gave us today long before. Are we on the highway to abandonment with pleasure without principle, pleasure without boundaries? Think about it. Think about it. You can't have everything. You can't. Meaninglessness is the plague of an average university student around the globe today. I could find better ways to make a living than what I'm doing. But this is a calling. This is a conviction. And I will tell you, I have seen lives transformed who've taken that path and turned away from complete hedonistic paths to a life that builds its moral boundaries with the revelation of God himself. Secularization is a good entry point. No, we do not want a theocratic culture. We do not want a state religion. That would be even worse. But secularization that does not allow religious discourse in the public square on the academy is going to end up with a generation devoid of shame. Pluralization, if it doesn't understand the laws of logic and moral boundaries, will end up ultimately living in systemic and systematic contradiction. It'll weigh down, it'll implode under the weight of its own loose living. And finally, privatization, where you sever the public from the private and you force a person to believe all the sacred things in private and never begin into the public square, you end up with a totally desacralized society. In the words of Albert Camus, the loneliest moment is when you have just experienced that which you thought will deliver the ultimate, and it has let you down. And so I say to you, ladies and gentlemen, if we are going to be civil in the square, if we are going to be respectful of each other's, we have three choices as an application. We can have a theonomous culture, a heteronymous culture, or an autonomous culture. A theonomous culture where we may believe that God's law is so ingrained in our hearts that we all think the same way. There is no culture around like that. India is the closest thing to it, but most cultures will not accept that because it'll come close to making a state religion. We don't want a theonomous culture. We haven't had it in history to see it once we did away with natural law. Heteronymous culture is that which a handful from above dictate to the masses below. Islamic states are heteronymous cultures. Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia are heteronymous cultures. They enforce the belief from the few over the masses. In Marxism, in China, in Russia, they are heteronymous cultures dictating to the masses what they must believe. Theonomous, we don't see it visible. Heteronymous is not where America needs to go. So you've got an autonomous culture, autos meaning self, nomos meaning law, where we pride in our individuality. If that is true, then we must be respectful of each person's belief, and I must be respected for my belief too, in the Word of God, in my commitment to Christ, and let the truth ultimately win out. If we are truly going to be autonomous, let's follow it through. Let's not tell people we have an autonomous culture, and as soon as they say they believe in God, switch to an heteronomous technique and enforce them not to believe in the liberty of their own conscience, but compel them to believe in something else. Theonomous, heteronomous, autonomous. And I believe the last is our option here. And in the marketplace, in the debating square, truth will win out. And if that happens, America has hope for the future. That is my talk for you tonight. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now encourage you to text your questions. This is the way that we're going to be conducting the Q&A. And to start, we have the question, what are some practical ways to engage peers without being dogmatic?
Since that's an easy one, I'll take it. This is Nabil Qureshi, by the way. I think you'll really enjoy listening to his, with those of you who were at the talk last night. As I told you, he's a medical doctor by training, but then did his master's work in biblical studies at Duke, and took another one at another master's degree at Biola, and he is about to enter into his doctoral program of studies as a medical doctor now, but going into doctoral work in his philosophical pursuits. He will also be sharing the Q&A. I think it is very important to engage in dialogue. Dogmatic claims can be stated as something that is truly believed in your conviction, but it must be justified, not just asserted. Why do I lay claim to what I do with such deep conviction? For example, if somebody asks me, why do I support the Christian worldview? My answer is very simple to them, because there are 4 questions of life: the question of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. And when I test out each one of those in their truth component, I can find answers, biblical answers on origin, meaning, morality, and destiny that conform to reality as I can test it out. And when the 4 answers are given together, they provide a coherent worldview. So is that a dogmatic belief? Yes, it is believed in the sense of a conviction, but it is defended with grace, undergirded by kindness, and not in a bullish or a mean-spirited way. If truth is not undergirded by love, it makes the possessor of that truth obnoxious, and the dogma he possesses becomes repulsive. So you must hold on to it with compassion and kindness and courtesy, but it must also be defended at the same time. So carry on a dialogue. Don't be afraid of laying claim to truth, so long as you have ably defended it, and the counter perspective has a challenge to question what you believe, and at that point you have to unpack it and give a response. That's how dialogue actually goes. It's the interaction of logic. It's two different views coming together, and the dialogical method is the best way. Let me give you, can I take a minute on this and give you a classic example of this? Because I think this is fascinating to understand. When I spoke at the Islamic University in Malaysia, prior to my coming there, the great Islamic apologist Ahmed Deedat had come and really attacked the Christian worldview wholesale. Any one of you who's ever read anything by Deedat or ever heard him, he's passed away now. He lived in Durban, South Africa. Vitriolic, hostile in the way he debated. And he truly offended the Christians in the audience, albeit they were a minority. A professor of geology there, Professor Lee, put his hand up. And he said, I have a question for you. Why do you attack what I believe and call it inconsistent and unlivable? So Deedat says, come up here to the front. Come up here right now. So Professor Lee, who's a professor of geology at the Islamic University in Malaysia, walks up to the front. Professor Lee himself told me this story. He said, I walk up to the front, and Deedat looked at me, and he said, come up closer and stare me in the eye. And Lee did. He took his right hand and gave him one heavy-handed slap on the face. And this is a gently built man, Professor Lee. He said, my face was burning and my whole body was quivering. And he said, as I gathered my composure, he said, turn the other cheek now. Turn the other cheek. That's your faith. Lee said, I didn't know I could handle it. I said, God, give me strength. And I turned the other side of the face, and there was some hisses coming from the audience. So he said, all right, I'll solve this in a hurry. Give me your shirt. So Lee unbuttons the shirt. He says, you're supposed to give me your trousers too. So he turned to the audience. He said, my students, please forgive me for doing this. But my faith in Christ is real, and I want to show this man it is real. It's not fake. He unbelted his trousers, standing there with his face in pain in his underwear, turns around and walks back into his office. Professor Lee told me there was a lineup outside my door, knocking, knocking, knocking. My own Islamic students wanting to have just 1 minute with me, some of them coming on bended knee asking me for forgiveness for what had just been done to him. You can present dogmatic truth with love and gentleness without being obnoxious. Sometimes it'll be in kind, sometimes it'll be in word. It must always be with a gracious spirit, because the truth unbeautified becomes unattractive, and it can be defended well. Okay, thank you.
The next question is, how can we in the university of today effectively impact our culture of subjective tolerance?
Do you want to take that?
Yes. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I really resonate with this question. I feel like I'm a perpetual student. At least that's what my wife tells me. I've finished studying at, as was just said, at Duke in Biola, and I had my medical degree as well, so a long time in the university. And one thing that I found out is that as you study in the university, when people hear what you have to say, they often don't really listen to it. They don't really care what you have to say, because everyone has an opinion. Opinions are cheap nowadays. Opinions come, as many as there are people, you'll hear opinions. What they really want to hear is how much you care. And they don't want to just hear that, they want to see that. And once you embody what you actually believe, then your beliefs start to come out more openly, more visibly. When I was in medical school, one of the things that I absolutely believed at the time, and I still believe today, is that life is valuable. Life is valuable at all phases. And one way that I expressed it was in an exam room, in a surgery exam room. A woman had come in, and she had come in for a completely unrelated case. And they were about to do an examination on her. They were about to do something which required her to not be pregnant. Now, she did not know she was pregnant. She had no idea she was pregnant. I asked her if she took any kind of precautions on a regular basis, and she said no, she didn't, because her boyfriend had told her that that he was sterile. So this was the understanding with which she came into the situation. Now, when I asked her to just double check, when the surgeon comes in to ask you if you want to do this procedure, make sure you double check with him. You actually do this test to see if you're pregnant. And she asked me why, what would happen. And it was at that moment that I was able to explain to her that there could very well be a life inside her. And that life inside her would be affected forever based on the decisions she made at this moment. And it is in that kind of situation, when I'm reaching out to her and telling her how valuable life is, that I'm then able to tell her what my beliefs are. And in that circumstance, when there's real life in the balance, when there's real emotion and real power in that moment, then when you share with someone your beliefs, they matter. Whereas if you stand on a street corner and pontificate without people knowing that you care, it's not going to work. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand street preachers. I understand the impetus of standing on a street corner and yelling to people who are walking towards death and destruction. What you want to say to them, the message you have to them, you just want to get it out there. But unless they know that you care, it's not going to matter. It's not going to work. So whenever I engage in any kind of conversation with someone, I want to know what their struggles are personally. I want to know what they're going through personally. I ask them what's going on in their life, and I connect with them at a personal level. And once you do that in the university setting, then they will see that what your beliefs are actually do matter. Thanks.
Okay, our next question. How do we profitably discuss hyper-politicized topics such as abortion, marriage, and sexual norms?
Abortion, marriage, and sexual norms. How do we profitably discuss it?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's interesting how much culture plays into this. In some parts of the world, these are things that will never even be discussed publicly because it will be offensive in certain audiences to even pontificate on those issues. Here, fortunately, in the sense that we have an open culture in which we can talk about these things. My own view is this to the questioner. Thank you for asking this, because I think these are the issues that are bringing so much hurt within our culture, so much pain to people, so much rancor, so much offense. And so here's what I say oftentimes when I'm speaking in audiences. I say, look, we will differ in applicational matters. We will differ in matters of inference. We will differ in matters of choices all along the way. But it'll always boil down to one question to each of us. What is your starting point? That's what I am interested in. That's the key. Because, you know, some years ago I was asked to do a lecture at Johns Hopkins on the subject, what does it mean to be human? Francis Collins and I were representing the Judeo-Christian side of it and all other scholars from different vantage points. And when I began to prepare for my talk, it dawned on me how critical that question really is. On the basis of how you've answered the question, what does it mean to be human? All of your other extensions and applications are made. Your application in sexuality, your application in pleasure, your application in truth-telling, in relationships. All of these emerge from the bottom line definition of what you believe it means to be human. For example, if you were to take an automobile and use it to run over another human being, you can't blame the maker of the automobile for killing that other human being. The automobile maker will say, that's not the purpose of why I made this car. If you cannot take an instrument and use it for a purpose for which it was not made, and therefore try to think you can blame the maker of that instrument, how can we really define sexuality, marriage, values, if we don't know the purpose of our lives? That, to me, is where we need to be discussing these very carefully. Is life sacred? Is life at its core of intrinsic worth and not extrinsic worth conveyed by state? Let me give you a vivid example of this. When I finished a series of talks at Oxford, we were talking on the nature of absolutes. And one young Oxonian came up to the front, and he was pretty articulate in what he said. He said to me, you know, of all the things you've said today, the one thing I really take issue with is the absolute. He said, I don't agree with you that there needs to be an absolute. I said, if you don't talk about an absolute, you're talking about a one-ended stick. I don't even understand. Everything is relative. And we went on this road. He said, I don't believe there are absolutes. I said, all right, let me ask you this question. And there were students standing around him, his classmates. I said, I take a one-year-old baby in your presence, and I put that baby on this platform where I'm standing, and take a jagged-edged butcher knife and chop this baby up for my pleasure. Would you believe I have done something bad or something evil? I kid you not. He paused. He went like this with his toe, and then he looked at me and said, you know, Mr. Zacharias, I wouldn't like what you did, but I cannot honestly tell you you would have done something evil. And all of his classmates standing around him went, whoa. You see, when you start from the premise that everything is of pragmatic value and nothing of essential value, you veer off into the distance with nothing remaining sacred anymore. What is it in the Ten Commandments that really are summarized in one word? Your body is sacred, your life is sacred, your possessions are sacred, your marriage is sacred, your word is sacred, your time is sacred, and so is your neighbor's. You don't violate that. So if you ask me how we talk on these things, I think it is the wrong starting point. We have to start with the foundation. And a best illustration is in the University of Ohio. When I was being driven there to my lecture, you go past the Wexner Center of the Arts. And the man driving me said, that's America's first postmodern building. I said, what's a postmodern building? He said, it has no purpose. There are really no designs. There are stairways that go nowhere. There are rooms that are of odd shape. It has no, he said, and the architect said, if life itself has no purpose, why should our buildings have any purpose? He said, what do you think? I said, I have one question for that architect. Did he do that with the foundation as well? City Hall would never give you the permission to build a foundation with no purpose. The foundation has to have a purpose. So in all of these discussions, you have to start from the foundation. What does it mean to be human? Is life sacred or desacralized? On those two edifices, you build the rest of the infrastructure. Otherwise, you've got your feet firmly planted in midair, and you can't stand on that. Okay.
Okay, these are two related questions from different students. How do you explain the tragedies caused by the proliferation of Christian beliefs, like the Crusades? And was manifest destiny and the subsequent extermination of Native Americans done graciously?
I'll take part of that. The first part of the question was, how do we explain the tragedies caused by Christians?
Yes, by the proliferation of Christian beliefs.
By the proliferation of Christian beliefs. Well, part of what my story is that I was raised Muslim. I was raised very, very devout Muslim growing up. My family taught me to believe in everything that Islam taught. My mother is actually the daughter of a Muslim missionary. She was born in Indonesia, though she was from Pakistan, because her father spent his whole life preaching Islam in Indonesia. That's how devout our Islamic heritage and upbringing was. And so part of growing up for me was to really embody and embrace Islam. And so when I met Christianity, I had been taught not just to embody and embrace Islam, but to respond against Christianity. That was part of my identity. Being from a foreign upbringing in the West, we wanted to galvanize ourselves against foreign influence. My parents had seen what America was like. They had heard things before coming here, and they had these presuppositions when they came here that America is a promiscuous nation. They see things on television, they see adultery on television, they see people carousing, and then they think America is a Christian nation. This is what's on American TV, therefore this must be Christianity. And so when they were raising up me and my sister, they wanted to make sure we were defended against Christianity. And so that was part of what I was coming up, was just naturally antagonistic towards the doctrines and beliefs of Christianity. Now, one thing that I noticed when I was being introduced to the theology of Christianity that struck me tremendously as a Muslim was just how powerful this idea is that God himself was willing to lower himself, to become a human, to suffer at the hands of men, and then die for their sake. Now, I just stopped and I thought about this for a second. This is the gospel message. This is the center. This is the crux of the Christian claims. That God, who deserves everything, who deserves to be worshipped by all creation, that God doesn't lord it over people. He's not a tyrant that demands that we jump through hoops so that he can be happy with us when we die and hopefully he'll let us into heaven. You know, in Islam, the soteriology, we had, in Urdu, we called it gunnah and sawab. There's an idea of blessings and of sin, and you have to outweigh your sin with your blessings in order to get into heaven. At the end of the day, you have to have more good deeds than bad in order to get into heaven. And so for me, growing up, the idea was simple. If I sinned, I needed to do more good in order to outdo that. I shouldn't sin, but, you know, if I run a stop sign, stop at the next one twice, you know? Just kind of counteract your sin, and you'll be okay at the end of the day. That's how I was raised. But constantly what I was thinking was, did I pray my prayers? Did I do the fast right? Did I accidentally swallow some water when I was in the shower? When you're fasting, you're not allowed to drink any water at all. Did I accidentally swallow some water when I'm in the shower? Because if I did, that's a sin. I broke my fast. And I'm worried constantly, all the time. Have I committed some tragic mistake? When I was introduced to this idea of Christianity, it was mind-blowing. Because here's what it is. God knows that you're going to sin against Him. God knows that you have sinned against Him. I don't need to convince anyone that they've sinned. All I have to do is ask someone, do you believe that you have lived up to your standards? To your own standards. Forget anyone else's standards. Have you lived up to your own standards? And everyone I've asked that question to has said, no. And here's the beauty of the Christian message. That God loves you anyway. And He doesn't just love you in a sense of, oh, I'll let you be and I accept you for who you are. God loves you so much that He's willing to die for you. That is the message of Christianity. What did Christ do? He gives this message of the Good Samaritan. This is in the book of Luke. He talks about a Jew and a Samaritan. These are two polar opposites in their culture, insofar as one did not have meals with the other, one did not care for the other, and yet Jesus, a Jew himself, upheld in this story the ideals of a Samaritan who's willing to sacrifice himself for the sake of his enemy. And not just did Jesus share that story, He then lived it out. For as Christian theology tells us, He was willing to die for our sakes, even when we were His enemies. Understand this for just one moment. The Christian theology is teaching us that God, who created the heavens and the earth, who is due all glory and all fame and all honor, was willing to be born as a child to two children themselves, and then to be bearing the ignominy of being an illegitimate child. Why? Why? And as he grows up as an illegitimate child, what is he doing? He's working with his hands as a carpenter, the lowest of low, a tekton. Why? Why does he choose this? What was his lineage? His lineage was one that had prostitutes in it. His lineage was one that had idolaters in it. Why? As he goes and as he suffers at the hands of those who are flogging him, the people that he had poured his life into for 3 years all fled. They all betrayed him. What is Jesus teaching? He didn't have to do any of this, by the way. According to Christian theology, He didn't have to do any of this. He could have come as a prince. He could have come as a king. He could have come and lorded Himself over people, but He did not. Why? Jesus is showing that He empathizes with our lowness, with our meekness, with our traits that people would look at us and spit upon us for. Jesus empathizes with that. And He willingly takes it upon Himself. And then He suffers for the sake of His enemies. That is the Christian message. Jesus tells us as He's dying on the cross, killed by those He's dying for, He says to us, through what He's already taught us, He says, as I do for you, as I have loved you, go and love one another. That is the true Christian message. And I don't care what anyone comes with. Other than that message, it's not the message of Jesus. There is no suffering that can be justified by that message of Jesus. There's no tragedy, no crime, no genocide that can be justified with the message that says, die for your enemies. Be willing to die for them. This is the most peaceful message there is. This is the most self-sacrificial message there is. That's the message of the gospel. So when people hijack the name Christianity and commit atrocities in that name, don't confuse the name with the gospel message itself. And what we're standing here for today is the gospel message. We're not here to excuse the actions of those who committed tragedies. Yes, there are Christians throughout history who've done horrible things. And if I'm the first one to apologize for that, please, sincerely, I apologize that this was done in the name of my God. But that is not the message of my God. We are to lay down ourselves for the sake of anyone who disagrees with us. And when it comes to tolerance, that is, I think, the most ultimate embodiment of tolerance. Not only do you hear what your enemy has to say or what someone who disagrees with you has to say, not only do you hear that and nod and smile, you actually come alongside them and after your disagreement, you sacrifice yourself for their sake. That is the most tolerant message that there could possibly be. And that is true Christianity.
Was there another part to the
There
question?
wasn't. I don't remember.
Was there a significant other part, or do we move on to the next one? Yeah.
Would you like me to repeat the question?
Sure.
All
yeah.
right. How do you explain the tragedies caused by the proliferation of Christian beliefs like the Crusades? And was manifest destiny and the subsequent extermination of Native Americans done graciously?
Okay, I think when you move to the particular from the general, the question is implicitly answered out there. Let me just, because it's been so beautifully presented in what the gospel is, let me just present two counterpoints here from the philosophical side of it. The first point is this. Whenever a question like this is raised, notice what is implicit in the question. Two things are implicit in the question. Number one, that human life has value. Human life has worth. How does naturalism give you that worth? Where does it come from? You cannot give intrinsic worth naturalistically. There has to be that transcendent value implicit in the human life. So the question actually posits an assumption that naturalism cannot really give to itself. Let me give you a little illustration of this. When I'm writing a book right now with my colleague from Oxford on why suffering, why pain. And I was watching a BBC production. It's a beautiful, beautiful production on polar bears. And I was just watching it so beautifully unfold, and the polar bear comes out of hibernation and has to feed its cubs. It gets onto the ice, but the ice is not as thick. It's taking longer to get to its prey. Comes to a pack of walruses, sets its eyes on the weakest of them, the baby one, and is about to pounce on it, but the other walruses come up to defend. A fight ensues. The polar bear doesn't win it out, and the walruses protect their little one. The polar bear turns around and walks away. And the last scene is the polar bear digging a grave for itself. It's not going to make it. And the BBC commentator, who had done a brilliant job so far, now goes into this. Why did it take so long for the polar bear to get to its prey? Because of global warming. And so we go on this big talk. Let's assume everything he said is right. What is he implying? He didn't for a moment question why this polar bear was being mean and looking at a tiny little walrus, when if its own little cubs were attacked, boy, it would draw blood. But that's not a moral question. It's truly in that predatorial animalistic setting. That's the misery of each is supposed to make up the good of all, and so you see it happen. Why did he lay moral responsibility to only one entity? That was a human being. We cannot seem to escape the fact that we are not mere animals. We have something that transcends animal instinct. We have a moral consciousness. So the assumptions of a question like this, A, give implicit worth to humanity. Secondly, that we have moral responsibility, neither of which can come from a naturalistic framework. So it has to come from a transcendent framework. Number two, never, ever judge a philosophy by its abuse. Never, ever judge a philosophy by its abuse. Take the integral claims of the philosophy, measure it against its claims, then critique it. If you abuse that philosophy and that critique, then you ultimately end up really judging something that it is not purporting to be. That's why Winston Churchill said democracy is the worst form of government, except for all other forms of government. And what he was trying to tell us is freedom is a privilege, but if freedom is abused, then you end up destroying the structure completely. So A, it assumes essential worth. B, it assumes moral responsibility, neither of which come from naturalism. C, you do not judge a philosophy by its abuse. That's why state religions have committed so much of heinous acts, because politics got wedded to theology, and the same depraved condition moved into a palace and used its power to dictate its will upon others. The true belief of the Christian comes from the freedom of the will and the freedom of choice. Jesus never forced his belief on anyone. We live in a day where we can learn from those atrocious and terrible mistakes. And you know what? Those of us who see the abuse of groups of people like that, we should do everything in our power to take the message of Jesus and the love of Jesus to bring healing and restoration, because it is the Lord that has created them and created all of us, and we see each other with intrinsic worth. What we could probably do is take one more question, and then I'll make a closing statement. Yeah.
And for our last question, how do you explain the difference between the need for shame and intolerance? Isn't a system of shame inherently intolerant?
Did you get that? How do you explain?
How do you explain the need for...
The need for shame and intolerance. Isn't it a system of shame inherently intolerant?
Oh, I think this is based on when you talked about shame.
Yeah, so is that is the idea, I'm not hearing it clear, is the idea of shame intolerant?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what?
Isn't it a system of shame inherently intolerant?
That's a great question, by the way. Really a good question. And the reason I say it is because I was born in a culture where shame is really used as a constant motivator to perform more. When I was not doing well in my school and was interested more in becoming a cricketer than getting any intellectual prowess of that sort, my dad would just lambaste me, or I'd get the worst kinds of thrashings. And the line he used on me one day, which ultimately broke my spirit, when he said, "You are going to bring shame to this family." And I think what we often do is use shame in order to hurt people. And that's really not what I'm talking about when I talk about the sense of shame as a warning. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Great Divorce, talks about it. He said, shame is like a hot drink. You can steadily drink it right down to the dregs, but you do anything else with it and it'll scald you. Shame is a personal corrector within your heart and mind where something wrong has been done, not for society to hurl its insults on you. They are two completely different things. But look at it this way. Psychiatrists are talking about a morning after drug for people with post-traumatic stress disorder. I know we've got veterans here and those who've been on the front lines. When I was in my mid-20s, I went to Vietnam. I was not prepared to see what I saw. I was a youngster. I was a student of theology. I was working with the chaplains. Many, many times after that, for weeks, I would be thinking back of the sights I saw on the side of the road. It traumatized me. The first night I came to Singapore, the free country, after speaking in Vietnam for 4 months, going all the way to the demilitarized zone and seeing all that was going on. I was a single young man. I'll never forget walking for 1 or 2 hours that night, just wishing almost I could slip that head and just let the memories of it out, because I didn't want to go back with that. And those of you who fought and the front lines and so on, I just met a young man here who was in Afghanistan and so on. We need to pray for them because the memories of these things take their toll. Here's the point. So doctors are dealing with this, how to deal with this medicationally. One of the fears of finding a medication to help those with legitimate stress and the disorder that comes. What if a rapist or a murderer does the same thing, rapes and murders, and goes and buys a pill and pops it the morning after with no remorse or no sense of feeling of wrong or shame whatsoever? What then happens to our society? So the same thing that benefits in a legitimate, stressful situation can be used in an illegitimate situation by people perpetrating wrong and doing violence for violence's sake. What I therefore boil it down to is this. In my heart and in your heart, where lines have been crossed that are wrong, I believe it's God's way of reminding you and me that what happened there was not right. And the more you work that away and make that which was illegitimate legitimized, you move more and more towards becoming a monster without any remorse of any kind. So I'm really not talking about a cultural imposition upon a person. I'm talking about the personal realization that wrong has been done. When culture imposes it wrongly, it is also a shameful thing to do. We don't work that methodology if we want the long-term results of good, which is for goodness sake. One more comment in my closing statement here. Oscar Wilde, I wrote a series of books on imaginary conversations, and one of them is the one that I really struggled with most, and yet at the same time delved into quite a bit, where I did one on Jesus talks to Hitler, the Lamb and the Führer, Jesus talks to Buddha, the lotus and the cross, Jesus talks to Krishna, new birth or rebirth, and the one on Oscar Wilde is called Sense and Sensuality, Jesus talks to Oscar Wilde. It is interesting, this quintessential hedonist, who may have autobiographically written The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is a brilliantly written book. He is lying on his deathbed in Paris. I visited the place and visited the church where his funeral was held. And ironically, it's the same church where Pascal's funeral was held. That's why in my book I have Pascal Wilde and Jesus in conversation. But here it is. He is lying on his bed and he looks at his lover, Robbie Ross, and he asks him this question. Did you ever love any one of those boys for their own sake? When I was reading that, I said, wow. Why does a hedonist all of a sudden look for an expression of a definition of love, where you're loving somebody for their own sake? He says, Robbie, did you love any one of these boys for their own sake? Robbie says, no. He says, neither did I. Neither did I. Bring me a priest, he said. And if you have never read his poem, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, it's one of the most powerful pieces of poetry, where he talks about the woman with the alabaster ointment who brought it and poured it at the feet of her Lord. And he said, so am I, like that, desperately in need of cleansing, for only blood can cleanse my blood, is what he said. And he went on to talk about only the sacrifice of Christ was now big enough to cleanse him and help him get rid of that tormented soul with which he was living. And so I say to you, as you see the nature of shame and guilt, it is interesting how at the closing moments of life, you want to find the right definitions for what you did. Did I love that boy for his own sake? No. Bring me a priest. Only Christ is big enough now. I want to tell you, and I'm really not being funny, if I'd come here in my teens and 20s, I would never have gotten into an institution like this. Those of you who are students here, and all the more those of you who are faculty here, you are privileged to be in one of the greatest institutions in the world, which basically tells me you are a very bright person. You're the brightest of the bright. And there are scores of people who will never reach your level of attainment or even possibility. What a privilege you have to be in a country like this, to be in an institution like this. University means to find unity in diversity. You will never find unity in diversity if you don't start from the sacred definition of what life is all about. We will have our differences. I just challenge you. Be patient, be kind, be tolerant. Those of you who disagree with us, you will never hear an ill will word from me. I don't desire to do that. I want to live and let live. But all I ask, if an academy is going to be honest, please give it the platform to proclaim dissenting views peaceably and let the truth win out in the end. If you stifle a worldview just because you don't like it, that's not a fair education. Truth will ultimately triumph. And I close with this illustration. Some of you have heard me give it. When I was in the Middle East, trying to bring reconciliation between the Jewish and the Palestinian forces, I was one of 5 others who was invited by the Archbishop of Canterbury. And we were with the worst of them in their vitriol, Yasser Arafat, and all were part of the meeting. I blocked out of the Yasser Arafat meeting because I really felt he'd have all the cameras flashing there. He was going to use it for publicity, and my guess was right. That was the only one with which I told the Archbishop, I don't feel comfortable. I think this is going to be used rather than legitimately given a platform. But I met with everybody else. On the last day we were in Ramallah, with Sheikh Talal, solidly built guy, who was one of the 4 founders of Hamas. His wife put on a great lunch, invited many of Arafat's right-hand men and men who'd been in prison for all kinds of acts. He himself, I think, had served 18 years. Great meal. The room is now full of cigarette smoke. And I'm struggling with my voice because I'm really allergic to that, with 2 vocal ulcers. But we are going through the whole thing. And at the end, the Archbishop says, I'd like each one of you men to ask him one question. Just one. I won't tell you what I asked because the meeting was private, but I didn't like his answer. And when I finished listening to his answer, I said, Sheikh, you and I will probably never see each other again. I was sitting pretty close to him. I said, I want to just say one thing to you and leave that with you. I said, 5,000 years ago, a man you and I respect by the name of Abraham took his son up a mountain to offer his son in sacrifice. Remember that story? He said, yes. I said, please, let's not debate which son it was. Let's just agree it was his son. He said, yes. I said, he takes his son up and as a test of his faith is going to offer his son to somehow gain God's approval there. And as the axe is about to come down, God stops his arm, keeps him from going through. Remember that story? He said, yes. I said, what did God say? I said, God said, stop. I myself will provide. He said, that's right. I said, here in Ramallah, we're very close to a hill. 2,000 years ago, God kept that promise and took his own son up that hill. Sheikh, at that time, the axe did not stop. Son of God, spade for you and for me. And what I want to leave with you is this, Sheikh. Until you and I receive the son that God has provided for us, we'll be offering our own sons and daughters on the battlefields of this world for power, for land, for position, and for prestige. Till you and I receive that son, that's what we'll be doing, offering our own sons. And he'd offered some of his sons. There's pin drop silence in the room. And the Archbishop says, I guess it's time for us to go. I figured I'd blown it. So we're walking away, and the Archbishop comes and puts his arm around me, and he says, thank you, Ravi, that was of God. I said, boy, I sure hope so. And we're going down the steps, and the Archbishop is a guest of honor. The Sheikh is ushering him. Little did I know he was hastening the procedure to come running over to me. He comes running over just as I'm about to get into the car. He twirls me around. Big guy. I've got 2 metal rods in my back. I figured, Ramallah, a grave waits for me now. He twirled me around, he looked at me, and he patted me on both sides of the face. And he kissed me. And he said, Mr. Zacharias, you're a good man. I hope you and I see each other again someday. And he gave me a big bear hug, and we bid each other goodbye. 2 different worldviews, 2 different political agendas, same answer for both. The Christ in the heart that would give you peace and take away the sword, take away the hate. It spoke to him, and his eyes were moist with tears, and I could just see how deeply he was reflecting on it. Tolerance, we will hopefully live to see day after day after day, where in our disagreement, we can still embrace one another and say, as a fellow human being, I respect your right to live peaceably within yourself, but there is a God in the end who will judge each one of us, and I live my life with that sacred trust that my life is a gift from him, and for that I want to honor him in body, mind, and soul. That's my prayer. Dartmouth, all the best to you. May your greatest days be ahead. Thank you for hosting us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. just a few things. Again, thank you so much for coming and joining us tonight. Thank you again to Dr. Ravi, Dr. Nabil, and all of the organizers and sponsors. Please leave your survey on your seat for us to pick them up, and fill out the survey online when you get the email. There is also a table in the hallway facing the Hinman room, mailroom, right through the double doors, passing the dining area. As well, all Dartmouth students and affiliates, includes faculty and staff, are invited to join us for a reception at the top of the hop. And this is a good opportunity for those of you that might not have gotten your questions answered. Please join us for the reception. Have a great night, and thank you so much.